Welcome to another exciting episode of the Aarthi and the Sriram Show. Now, this week, we have something different. We have been asked by a lot of people to bring together some of the great content that we have put out over the last couple of years. So we have a compilation of some of the best advice from one of our favorite guests on the show, Marc Andreessen. Marc is one of a kind and he has not held back. And this is going to be quite some fun. We'll be back with fresh content next week. But until then, enjoy Marc Andreessen. How do you decide or know whether an idea for a startup is good or not?
So the big thing is most of the obviously good ideas are bad ideas for a startup, right? And the reason is because most of the obviously good ideas, if they're obviously good ideas, they're already getting done by big companies, right? So what are big companies really good at? Like just take all the top 50 whatever tech companies. What are they really good at? They're really good at doing the next obviously good idea, right? They're like, what's a good idea? A smartphone whose battery lasts 10% longer. Yeah, like Apple's on it, right? They got like 10,000 people working on that, right? There's no startup opportunity there. And so we always say kind of by definition, like if it's a good startup idea, it can't be a good idea that looks like a good idea because a big company's already doing that. It almost always has to be a good idea that looks like a bad idea, right? So it has to be something that is contrarian, counterintuitive, non-obvious, right? It has to be something that everybody else hasn't already figured out. It has to be important, right? It has to matter, right? The actual thing has to actually matter in a way that anybody's gonna ever actually care about it. And then, going back to what we just talked about, like you have to actually be correct, right? Like most ideas that look like bad ideas actually are bad ideas, right? In fact, the overwhelming majority of ideas that look like bad ideas are in fact bad ideas. And so you have to really be deep in the domain to be able to get to the point where you can say, okay, I know this looks like a bad idea, but I know that I'm right for the following, 18 reasons. And I know that if we do this, it will be this will matter. Your personality traits will tend to be very stable over your lifetime, right? And so if you take the test today, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you will get basically the same results, right? And so these are actually like stable in your system. By the way, with a nuance, which is generally over time, as people get older, their openness declines somewhat, and their conscientiousness grows somewhat. And again, if you kind of think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, that actually kind of makes sense, right? Because from a societal standpoint, right, you actually want younger people to be more adventurous, and then you want older people to be more stable, right, and more home-oriented.
Right. People fundamentally don't change.
They don't change for the most part. Like these changes are on the margin. They get somewhat less open. They get somewhat more conscientious. But like everything else, it's surprisingly stable.
Right.
Right. And so people are kind of wired the way they are.
Openness is being open to new ideas, thoughts, experiences, willing to experiment. Like that's the picture I have in mind.
Yeah, that's right. So it's openness to new ideas, and this is a very deep-seated thing in human nature, right? And so, and this applies across many areas of life. So how do you feel about reading a new book? How do you feel about trying a new kind of food? How do you feel about trying a new place to go on vacation? How do you feel about talking to somebody, right, who doesn't share a cultural background with you? There's value of openness. There's value for also, by the way, sort of not openness. Like at the population level, you want some people to be like explorers, but you also want some people to like stay home, right, and like keep the fires burning and like basically keep things stable. It's really hard to be creative if you're not open. And there's a subtlety, there's a nuance in there which is very important, which is, can a person who has sort of low openness, can they be creative? And it's like, maybe if they really force themselves, they might be able, like if they really force themselves to like write a poem, they might be able to, but they're not going to like it, right? It's like their nervous system is not wired that way. Right. And so you kind of need to close your eyes and kind of imagine, what if you took somebody who was born to be a musician, for example, and you forced them to become an accountant, right? Or vice versa. Like, what if you took somebody who was born to be an accountant and forced them to be a musician, right? And both people would be very, very unhappy. And so anyway, this is sort of the inherent trait of creativity, openness. So, directly related one is agreeableness, right? So open plus agreeable equals every new idea is a great idea, right? Equals non-discriminatory. Well, it's hard to be creative if you're not discriminatory. Like one of the things that great artists have in common is they're like actually really picky and choosy over what they think the great ideas are. And they throw away a lot of their like initial attempts. It's really complicated, right? And just start with like the default answer, which is most people don't. right? Like most people just don't think creatively. There's actually psychologists have actually this test where there's like they can actually test people's basically level of creativity, and the way they do it is there's like 15 different creative domains like art and music and writing and so forth, and software, and then there's like 7 levels of creativity ranging from like an amateur project you do in your spare time all the way to like a national award winner. And depending on how you fill out the matrix, you get your sort of creativity quotient, and most people score 0. So let me come at this in a couple different layers. There's a sort of a psychology layer. There's like a sociology layer, like group psychology layer. And then let's say there's a sort of a friends social network layer, which is really important, which we'll talk about. And then there's finally the kind of what do you do? Like how do you go about it? Like if you want to do more of it. So the psychological layer. So at the level of individual psychology, it actually turns out there's a science of sort of individual psychology that's long established over decades called psychometrics, and the sort of scientists who study this have settled in on this sort of model of human psychology. At the individual level, they call it the so-called Big 5 personality traits, and I find this to be a super interesting framework for thinking about exactly this kind of question. So, just to review quickly, so the Big 5 personality traits conveniently form the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, and so the traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And then basically, for each of those, basically there's like the trait, and then there's this opposite. So open versus closed, conscientious versus not conscientious, agreeable versus disagreeable, right? Extroverted versus introverted, neurotic versus, basically like emotionally stable. And then, interestingly, at the population level, each of those traits is distributed on a bell curve. And so in any population, any of these traits, most people are somewhere in the middle. They're kind of somewhat introverted, somewhat extroverted, somewhat open, somewhat not. And then you have these outliers where, you get these people who are on the fringes of the distribution. And, when it comes to creativity, basically who those people are just, they're incredibly highly open. So we use the same technique to ferret out whether founders are telling us the truth, basically, and actually have a good idea that homicide cops use to determine whether you actually killed somebody. If you're into crime movies, at least you've probably seen this scene in movies because it'll be in the movie occasionally, which is because what the homicide detective will do is basically they'll ask increasingly detailed questions, right? And so it's like, okay, whatever, you're whatever your friend was killed, on Thursday. Well, where were you Thursday night? Well, I was at the movies. Okay, well, which movie theater did you go to? Okay, I was at whatever, Regal Cinema, da 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 da. Well, who did you go to the movie with? I was by myself. Okay, what time was the movie? Which movie did you see? When they're guilty of a crime, basically what happens is like they basically are making as the questions get more and more detailed, they have to basically make up more and more details. Like most people can't anticipate all these eventualities ahead.
Right.
And so we basically do the same thing. And basically, this is why we call it the idea maze. So the concept of the idea maze is to really be the master of a domain, you have to really understand all of the twists and turns that require getting from kind of point A, which is like a vague idea of what you want to do, kind of all the way to point Z on the other side of the maze, which is an actual product that matters that you can build a startup around.
Right.
And you have to actually like think your way through all those steps. And the founders who are good at what they do think through, they take the time, they put in the effort, often years, right? Like what I find is it's almost always 5 years plus. Like this is not like a short-term thing. It's almost always somebody, the great successful companies, great founders almost always have thought deeply about the domain they're operating in for 5 years, often 10 years, often longer. And if basically you ask increasingly detailed questions, if the answers get more and more specific as the questions get more and more specific, that's really good. If the answers get more and more general and more fuzz, then it's like, okay, you're and by the way, okay, you're trying to pull one on us. Okay, by the way, you're also trying to pull one on yourself.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
Like if we can shake you out in that process, like you shouldn't be doing what you're doing anyway, because you haven't done you're not prepared you haven't done the work. You don't actually know what you're doing. The way to think about conscientiousness is it's split into two what are called aspects or kind of subtraits. There's industriousness and there's orderliness. Right. And this is interesting because you probably know people who are like super industrious, like bursting with energy. They get a lot of stuff done, right? They're very high momentum in their kind of, work ethic and performance levels, but they're very low orderliness. And so they just leave like a giant mess behind them. And you could probably think of a bunch of people like that. By the way, there are people who are like super highly orderly and not very industrious, right? And they're like, desk is always clean and everything is organized and they just don't get much stuff done. And then of course there are people, it's very unfortunate, like, maybe if there's, a sort of, there are kind of potholes in this process, and like, 0% orderliness, 0% industriousness plus 0% orderliness, is somebody who, basically never leaves their messy apartment. What's ideal, like, and then it's a fit for purpose, right? And so when you're talking about entrepreneurship, I think for sure you want a high degree of industriousness, right? You want, Paul Graham has a term for this. He calls this founder velocity, which is basically highly industrious people. They just get a lot of stuff done. It's the what have you got done this week, right? It's that idea. And so you definitely want that. And then basically, I think for founders, you need enough orderliness where they just kind of keep the wheels on,
right?
Right, and they're just able to like maintain a continuous stream of activity and not have everything just be like sheer chaos. The Marine Corps has the sort of motto or slogan of the Marine Corps is improvise, adapt, and overcome. And it's basically just like, look, no excuses. Like, something is not working. You're on a mission. You're out there trying to make something happen. And like, your boat, like, whatever, your boat breaks or like whatever happens or your gun jams or whatever it is, improvise, adapt, and overcome. Right. And get it done. Right. And if that doesn't work, improvise, adapt, and overcome again. Right. And just keep going. Use of data versus not, right? Data versus judgment. And so like what you often see with the companies that iterate is they're iterating, and then on top of that, they're using data, right? And then again, the consequence of that is like, maybe the data is not actually useful for inferring actually what's actually going to be helpful to get you to success. And maybe you're actually spending too much time optimizing the short-term metrics in addition to doing short-term product revisions. And so there's this tension trade-off between, do we use data and measure like how things are going, or do we use intuition and judgment? And I think an absolutist view on that is probably dangerous. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle for most people. The other is, by the way, do we talk to customers? Right. And you mentioned this earlier, like there is sort of an extreme kind of point of view that some founders have, which is like, I'm not going to talk to customers. I'm going to, Steve Jobs wouldn't talk to customers. Like, I'm just going to like, I'm going to make it up in my own head and people are going to want it. Like, I don't need to go talk to them ahead of time. And then look, there's a degenerate behavior in the other direction, which is people who talk to customers too much. And they go to the customer and they ask, what product should I build? And the problem is that the customers don't know, because the customers aren't in the business of building new products. So they don't know what they want. Like, and this is actually a Steve Jobs, nobody wanted the Macintosh before they built the Macintosh. Yeah. So generally what I'm looking for from books is timeless information. Right. And so it's basically, it's, permanent information or as close to it as you can possibly get. And then, just like the fact is a lot of that, how do you know that a book has timeless information? Is that the book stands the test of time, right? This is where the Lindy concept is really helpful. Look, if I'm finding, what often happens, I find out about a book from somebody who I think is interesting, somebody I think is interesting, I'm following them or talking to them, and they're like, hey, you should read this book. Right. And if it's a book that was published like 6 months ago, I'm like, I don't know. Let's wait 20 years and see how it does. If it's a book that was written 50 years ago, I'm like, okay, like there's a reason 50 years later why somebody who's interesting is recommending it today. Right. And I find that those are often the best. Those are, and again, it's very specific, the timeless information, like the information that doesn't change.
One final question. I'm going to let you go. Star Wars Andor. What do you think?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's outstanding. It's fantastic. There's this genius, Tony Gilroy, and he's probably best known for the movie Michael Clayton. But he has worked on and he's been kind of a script doctor and kind of behind the scenes guy on a very large number of the great movies of like the last 20 years. They basically, and he was basically, if you saw the movie Rogue One, which a lot of people think is like the best Star Wars movie since the original couple movies. There were other people that like started making the movie, and then basically the story goes is that Tony Gilroy kind of finished the movie. And look, it's the thing, like any serious telling, right? It's funny, right? Because it's like Star Wars, but it's like, okay, where's the war? Like where's the war story, right? Like where's the, there's a genre of war story, right? And there are many war, great war stories, war movies, whatever. And like in war, people die, right? Like and so right. Whereas if it's like a fantasy, it's like everybody gets lives and gets medals in the end. In a real war, people die. And so it's Rogue One was like the first actual war movie of that kind of set in that universe. And so anyway, so the story goes, Gilroy kind of came in and fixed the movie, redid the ending, and then they did this incredible thing they do in Hollywood from time to time, is they kind of picked a super genius and they put him in charge and let him run. And it's legitimately, and it's fascinating also because it's like he's doing. I think I know what he's doing. I mean, we're only halfway through it, so I think he's I have high hopes for the rest of I think he may be doing some very special things in where the story's going.